CBS News has received a detailed description of what appears to be a memo written by a whistleblower one day after President Trump spoke with the president of Ukraine in July. The memo is based on a conversation the whistleblower had with an unnamed White House official who listened to the call. We'll have more insight on that in just a bit. But first, Turkish forces have launched a military operation against Kurdish fighters in northern Syria. The military offensive comes just days after the Trump administration withdrew U.S. troops from the region near the Syrian border. The president's move has led to bipartisan backlash. Even some of his strongest Republican allies have called the move shameless and impossible to understand. Earlier today, the president stood by his decision.
We have no soldiers in the area. We're getting out of the endless wars. We have to do it. And eventually somebody was going to have to make the decision. And frankly, we're getting a lot of praise from that decision. People are saying, gotta sometime bring our people back home.
CBS News national security correspondent David Martin is at the Pentagon. David, what is the latest that you're hearing about what's happening right now in Syria?
Well, after a day of airstrikes and artillery strikes into northeastern Syria, the Turkish military now says it has begun the ground portion of its incursion into northeastern Syria. This is occurring along a front that is about 75 miles wide. The Syrian Democratic Forces, which are the Kurdish forces the U.S. has been supporting in the battle against ISIS, say they are resisting the Turkish troops as they attempt to come across the border. So you can say that the battle is joined between two U.S. allies, Turkey, the NATO ally, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, the U.S. ally in the war against ISIS. One of the most immediate effects of this is that the war against ISIS has been put on hold. One official called it effectively paused. No order has been sent out to stop operations against ISIS, but the fact is that the people who are doing the fighting, these Syrian Democratic Forces, are now focused on trying to repulse this Turkish incursion. So the battle against ISIS has, by necessity, been put on hold.
And David, what are you hearing about the level of concern within the Pentagon about ISIS reconstituting itself as these Turkish forces go after those Kurdish fighters?
Well, it really depends. I mean, it's easy to paint a worst-case scenario in which the Turkish forces go into northeastern Syria very deeply, and they stay for a long time. In which case, the battle against ISIS is put on effectively permanent hold, and as long as they're not under pressure, these ISIS sleeper cells are going to be able to regenerate. What's been going on, if you look at what happened last week in Syria, this is a sort of a low-level war now in which the victories consist of a single ISIS operative, a financier, or a bomb maker captured or killed, and this happens in 1 or 2 a week. So it's this very low-grade war in which the U.S. tries to gather intelligence, and then the Syrian Democratic Forces try to go after these ISIS operatives, and that's what's grinding to a halt now. It will take a while for that to have a major impact on giving ISIS a second win, but obviously it doesn't help. And I think the bigger concern is if the Turkish troops keep coming. The U.S. has already made a decision that it's not going to oppose this Turkish incursion. The U.S. military is just not going to fight back against the Turks. So if the U.S. then has to start getting more and more of its troops out of the way of this Turkish incursion, then at some point it's an effective withdrawal from northern Syria. The president is saying that that's what he wants to do. He wants to get all U.S. troops out, but no order to that effect has been given yet. But the longer this goes on, the more likely that becomes.
All right. David Martin at the Pentagon for us. David, thank you very much.
Sure thing.
For more, we are joined by Reuters White House correspondent Jeff Mason and USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page. Welcome to both of you. Jeff, I'd like to start with you. In a statement issued by the White House today, the president said in part, quote, "This morning, Turkey, a NATO member, invaded Syria. The United States does not endorse this attack and has made it clear to Turkey that this operation is a bad idea." The president then reissued this threat. Let's listen to that.
I will wipe out his economy if that happens. I've already done it once with Pastor Brunson. I'm sure that I hope that he will act rationally.
Jeff, is it clear at this point what exactly the White House considers to be out of bounds?
Well, I think the White House and the president in particular right there are trying to walk back a little bit, at least the impact of his decision. What exactly is out of bounds? I mean, I think he's hoping that despite the fact that Turkish forces are going in there, that the Kurdish, the U.S. allied Kurds will not be decimated in the way that many people are concerned is exactly what's going to happen. And the president, despite saying in that statement that you read, it's saying that in that statement that the U.S. doesn't support this operation, opened the door to the operation by making the decision that he did earlier this week.
Right. Some people say it was effectively green-lighted the Turkish forces to go ahead into northern Syria. The president has faced bipartisan criticism over his decision. Even some of his most ardent supporters are speaking out. And today, Senator Lindsey Graham called on the president to change course. Congresswoman Liz Cheney called the news sickening, saying it's impossible to understand the president's decision. So, Susan, as we take stock of this Republican reaction, how damaging is this for the president?
You know, the firestorm from Republicans has been remarkable in that on the issue of impeachment, on the Ukraine phone call, on all of that, they have stuck with President Trump all the way, but he has really ignited a lot of criticism. Lindsey Graham is one of his biggest defenders, including on impeachment, but his language has been really harsh. And what struck me about the remarks that the president just finished making was how he doubled down on his reasoning for taking this controversial step. He said that it was time to end these endless wars, that there's not a reason the United States should not be engaged in. That's been a consistent theme that he's struck since running for president. So in that way, this isn't a surprise. But this is such a reversal for U.S. policy, and it's one that's alarmed a lot of thoughtful people in town.
And Susan, what does this do to American credibility around the world? You know, beyond just the Syria situation, when you talk about American credibility as an ally that can be relied upon, what is the message that's being sent here?
You know, the fact is we have few allies with whom we have been more aligned than the Kurds. The Kurds have fought with us. They've fought on our behalf. They've paid dearly in terms of their own lives. And so for us to abandon them and in the space of a day, there wasn't some long policy process that let them know that this was in the works. I think that's pretty shocking. And it does, I think, probably raise concerns among others who might at one point be thinking about being an ally of the United States, working with the United States in some controversial place. It's going to be costly for them, about whether they can count on the United States to stick it out, to do what they said they were going to do, to be in it for the long haul.
Well, Jeff, in the meantime, CBS News has received a description of what appears to be a memo written by the whistleblower one day after President Trump spoke with Ukraine's president in July. Does this description bolster the credibility of the whistleblower?
Well, the description certainly matches what was said in the reporting, and more specifically in that transcript that the White House released. The president has been working to discredit the whistleblower. Democrats, of course, and others on the Hill and others in Washington have been concerned about any action that would not only try to discredit him, or her, but try to threaten him or her. So yes, I think that this account goes to support what was said originally and what ended up sort of sparking this impeachment inquiry in particular.
Susan, what have we been seeing in terms of the president essentially trying to go after the credibility of this whistleblower? It seemed to take another turn yet today.
Well, the president has been pretty fierce in attacking the whistleblower. He insists that he has a right to cross-examine him. That is not correct under the whistleblower law. The whistleblower is supposed to have some protections, both for the purposes of their career in government and also for their safety. You know, there's concern that the whistleblower has inflamed such passions that it might not be safe for him or her to be identified. We see Democrats on the Hill now discussing how they can have testimony from the whistleblower and still protect their anonymity. But the president has insisted that anonymity is not part of the deal, and he wants to cross-examine the whistleblower. He wants to know more about the whistleblower, and particularly about whether the whistleblower has been involved in politics in some way, because of course the president is saying this is a partisan attack, not one that's legitimate.
Well, Jeff, last week you got in a bit of a back and forth with the president over his phone call with President Zelensky. For people who may have missed it, let's go ahead and listen to some of that exchange.
What did you want President Zelensky to do with regard to Joe and Hunter Biden?
Biden and his son are stone cold crooked, and you know it.
The question, sir, was what did you want President Zelensky to do about Vice President Biden and his son Hunter?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, it was just a follow-up of what I just asked you, sir.
Listen, you ready? We have the president of Finland. Ask him a question.
I have one for him. I just wanted to follow up on the one that I asked you, which
Did
was,
you hear
what
me?
did you want
Did you
him
hear
to
me?
Yes,
Ask
sir.
him a question.
I will, but
I've given you a long answer. Ask this gentleman a question. Don't be rude.
All right, so I'm sure that moment is seared in your memory, Jeff Mason.
Yes.
But
I can confirm that.
Okay, great. But as to the substance, at this point, do we have a clearer answer from the president to the question that you were trying to get him to answer originally?
Well, he ended up answering it the next day when he was outside leaving the White House on a trip, and he spoke to reporters before getting on his helicopter, Marine One. And on that day, he ended up saying what we sort of knew the whole time, and what I was interested to see if he would say at that press conference, which was he wanted Zelensky and he wanted Ukraine to investigate the Bidens, and then he added the next day that he thought China should do the same. So in doing that, he gave more fodder to Democrats who are pursuing this impeachment inquiry, and he confirmed what was in the transcript that he has been calling perfect all along.
Right, and in answering the question the next day, it seemed to implicitly suggest that it was a legitimate question that was worthy of answering, just for the record. Okay, so in a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi Tuesday, the White House said it would not be complying with the impeachment inquiry. Jeff, do we know what it would actually take for the administration and the president to cooperate?
That's a great question, and we asked some reporter colleagues of mine asked on a conference call last night White House officials who were talking about the letter that was released yesterday to Speaker Pelosi, if in fact the Democrats, if the House ended up holding a vote, if that would spark cooperation by the White House, and the answer was we're not going to speculate. So it's hard to say what exactly would spark their cooperation, but for sure, for now, we know that their position is that they are not going to cooperate. They're not going to allow witnesses to speak. They're not going to submit documents. They're not going to respond to subpoenas. And if, in fact, the House does go down the road of taking a vote, which this letter said would be the constitutional way to pursue this process, then we'll have to see if that actually changes whether or not the White House, the president, and his people would cooperate.
Well, Susan, in her response, Speaker Pelosi tweeted at the president saying, "Donald Trump, you are not above the law. You will be held accountable." Why is Speaker Pelosi not willing to hold a vote, and what comes next for Democrats here?
Well, Speaker Pelosi has argued that it's not necessary to hold a vote, and not necessary to hold a vote at this point in time. But she hasn't ruled out holding a vote of the House to formally launch the impeachment inquiry, to basically approve what she's already done. And by the way, there's no question she would win if she did that. Democrats would stand behind her. The White House thinks this is a pressure play because it'll make some Democrats from swing districts uncomfortable. You know, some Democrats think it could put some Republican members of Congress in the hot seat, too. Republicans who represent swing districts could find themselves having to explain why they oppose even an inquiry, not necessarily impeachment itself, but looking at some of these allegations. So it's not impossible that we're going to see this vote taking place.
Are we starting to see, Susan, cracks in the Democrats' impeachment inquiry? If so, how do Democrats stay the course?
So Democrats have had some division on whether you need to have this vote. I think that if the vote is held, those cracks will disappear. Democrats, I think, are actually pretty united. I think there are now only 9 Democrats in the House who have not endorsed this inquiry, have not endorsed the idea of proceeding with an impeachment inquiry. That's a pretty unified caucus for a caucus that ranges from people elected in districts that were won by President Trump in 2016 to members who are from the most liberal and progressive parts of our country. And Republicans, of course, have also been pretty united. You know, this is a case where the polarization of our country has just come into high relief, where Republicans have gone into their corner, Democrats have gone into their corner, and it is rare to find the person who is willing to stroll outside those boundaries.
As things ramp up here, Jeff, Fox News says it has fired former Congressman Trey Gowdy as a contributor, and this comes amid reports that Gowdy is joining the president's legal team. What does hiring someone like Trey Gowdy signal to you?
In terms of hiring by the White House?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I think it signals, number one, that they're taking this impeachment inquiry even more seriously than it appeared that they were a couple weeks ago. We see that with the fact that this letter was released yesterday, and that sort of outlined their strategy of non-cooperation with the inquiry, and they're bolstering that essentially by adding to their legal team.
Susan, do you get a sense that we're nearing a constitutional crisis at this point?
Yes, I think we are. I think the fact that the White House is refusing to comply with congressional subpoenas represents something approaching a constitutional crisis. That is a very different view of what the Constitution requires of the president under our separation of power system, under the checks and balances that the founders set up.
All right, some interesting, turbulent weeks ahead, no doubt. Jeff Mason, Susan Page, thanks to you both for your insight. Really appreciate it.